Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 81 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May, Ubiquity University and upwards of 350 organizations from all over the world have come together to provide an open space between 5 and 7 o'clock p.m. Central European Time, so people worldwide can come share their feelings, share their experiences as we all navigate through this extraordinary pandemic, and take counsel together as to how we can more effectively give shape to a positive post-pandemic world. I happen to be in Paris. It's really hot today, nearly 93, 94 degrees Fahrenheit, 34 centigrade. So my internet is a little unstable. So I will keep my remarks very brief. But just to say that over the last 81 days, we've touched on almost every conceivable subject. In the last 3 or 4 days, on August 6th and August 9th, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We were made aware of the power of science and technology in the modern world. In many ways, our scientists have replaced our priests as the spiritual overseers of our civilization. They have inordinate power. They're unleashing inordinate power. So today we thought we would have a session on how science can be more collaborative. And I want to welcome our panel of scientists today, Valerie Luzadis, who will be convening our panel. She and I have been working over the last several months in conversation. So Valerie, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you and your colleagues, and I turn the program over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. And I want to thank you, Jim, and all the team at Ubiquity University for this incredible ongoing gathering that is Humanity Rising. And thanks to everybody who's joined us for this conversation about new mindsets for science today and radical collaborations and what that can mean. We're here today because we're thinking about the effort to create a more sustainable and resilient post-pandemic world. And as an ecological economist and a social ecological systems scientist, I have focused on sustainability throughout my career. Before the pandemic, we were facing a dual crisis of tremendous social inequality with the accumulation of wealth in a few hands, and tremendous ecological disruption with climate change, water issues, food security, and more. And now it's become a triple crisis with the global pandemic. We need solutions, and we need new mindsets. We need to be radical, creative, and innovative. And I argue that we also need to be inspired, and we need to inspire others. Specific solutions need to come from the bottom up, from the top down, from the left, from the right. However, it might take a new mindset to do this. So science provides us with an amazing knowledge that can be used to create more equitable and sustainable, resilient world. To achieve this transformation, we need to create truly innovative institutional structures, or simply put, we need new ways to live on the planet. This transformation is one in which story and science, imagination, innovation, intuition, and data all braid together toward understanding the unity of Earth's systems and inhabitants and the beauty of that heterogeneity. And I think one day the children of this planet will learn about this transformation, and they'll wonder at what came before, stunned at how people could have stood for such inequity, disrespected dualism and everything around them. So how do we change mindsets? And what kind of change do we need? So we all know the challenge of changing our minds. Once an idea is set, boy, is it hard to shift. Just think about it. So how many of us know someone who's so set in their ways that you can't even imagine them changing their minds? I surely know a few, and maybe more than a few. So how do we do this? How do we change our minds? So ask anyone who's ever kicked a habit, made a great personal or professional change. How did they get started? Well, they looked inside and they asked themselves good questions. And sometimes these questions or the possible answers are pretty frightening. And we all know the power of fear in our lives. Sometimes we're just afraid to look. We are all here at Humanity Rising because we know we must look. And science is one of the things that we need to look at. So how do we do this? Let's think about how we change our minds. Think about a moment when you saw someone change their mind, or when they realized that their mind had changed. What a powerful thing. As a scientist, I'll admit that data can change my mind. But when it comes to issues of values, it's not always data that does it, or only data that does it. Some of the most powerful shifts of mind that I've had, that I've experienced, or that I've observed in others have happened as a result of stories, personal stories. So when I first embraced the idea of stories, I had a lot to learn, because my education was all science all the time, and that did not include stories. And so I did what academics will do. I researched it, but I also talked with others about it. And the ideas of creativity, imagination, and intuition just kept coming up. And I thought, well, all that's okay in fiction and in creative endeavors, but in science? At least we never hear about it in science. So we all know science is fact-based, no place for imagination and intuition. But we also know that's not exactly true. Only we do not usually say that out loud. So I experience imagination and intuition not as creative in some childish way. Oh, it's only your imagination. But I experience that as an important aspect of my greatest personal and professional achievements. And I know many scientists for whom this is true. And it's time to talk about it. It's time to shift to a new mindset in science. It's time for radical collaborations. So imagination and intuition are incredibly important parts of everything we do, in science and otherwise. When we pay attention to them, we can learn to appropriately and usefully interpret them. So scientists rarely articulate when, where, and how imagination and intuition inform the scientific endeavor. And often the subject's not addressed at all in the teaching of science or in the scholarly research of areas. And this leaves students with the incomplete knowledge and likely an inaccurate idea or impression that imagination and intuition have no value in science, nor with the resolution of complex problems, including achieving a sustainability. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about my story, about how I came to this. So very soon after I became an assistant professor in a forestry department at a research university, I had a profound experience of direct knowledge. I was high in the canopy of an old growth forest, doing my best to manage my fear of heights. But as a tree lover and an environmental scientist, I could not pass up the opportunity to experience the forest canopy. So I went up in the crane, and it was during this experience of being among the crowns of the trees of the old growth forest that I suddenly knew how energy flows within the forest, between the trees, among all the parts, including what happens after disturbance, like when we cut trees. I had no idea how this could happen. Other than somehow maybe the trees told me. And of course, I didn't mention it to anybody. So upon my return to campus, I looked into the current understanding of how energy flows in a forest. And I asked colleagues who studied that. And I learned that the information that had come to me when I was up in that forest was at that time unknown to science. I didn't know what to do with the information I seem to now have, both because of the means of its appearance and the fact that this was not the science I was trained to do with my newly minted PhD. So I did nothing. I didn't even dare tell anyone about it. So years went by, nearly 20 years, and I heard a TED talk on the radio about the very thing that I had learned in the forest. It was a scientist talking about energy flows in a forest. I nearly fell off my chair. It was the scientist talking about, so I went and looked this up. And sure enough, They had completed studies that resulted in the very knowledge that had come to me when I was in the forest. I knew it was time to start having this conversation and talking about these things. So as my career advanced as an environmental scientist who studies social ecological systems and ecological economics, both are areas of study about relationships between people and nature, I realized that the ways in which we teach and learn science and research, and possibly most scholarly pursuits, that it's largely limited to rational, analytical, intellectual approaches. We do not teach students to listen and learn from everything, or if we do, it's at a level of simple observation that's essentially reduced by the solely intellectual focus of research. If we taught new scientists, new scholars to listen to everything that came to them in their lives, what would that look like? What if we did that, whether it seemed fanciful or not, whether it was from a dream they remembered or something that came to them when they were in the old growth forest? What if imagination and intuition were valued equally to intellect in the pursuit of knowledge? Of course, we would need to continue to teach about using intellect and analytical approaches at the same time. But bringing this all together, we would be asking better questions and getting to more useful knowledge sooner. And this is the sort of radical collaboration I'm talking about. So I have found that the way forward to do this is through the heart. We must learn to think through our hearts and feel through our minds to come to these new systems that we need. That link for me is heart. In order to engage my imagination, I have to free myself from the tyranny of my mind. Sometimes I have to unlearn things. And in order to hear my inner knowing, to have space for that direct knowledge, whether it's in the form of an intuition, a download, a conversation with a plant, I know I must listen through my heart. So what would science, scholarship, and knowledge itself look like if we linked the heart and mind in all that we do? So I've come to call this Heart Forward Science, and I started an organization with that name to address these issues. And I know many scientists and scholars who are heart forward. They came to this through their own personal pursuits, not as sanctioned by nor the design of the educational programs that they were in. And some had mentors within the academic world who helped them along this path, but most found their way by reaching outside the academy. And I propose that we create the scaffolding between these two currently separate pursuits, the development of intellect and mind and the development of heart and spirit. And I submit that we can create a scaffolding between these two that will help bring us to a more equitable and sustainable ways of living. And Heart Forward Science was established to do just that. So it's time for us now to illuminate pathways to allow for heart to lead in science. As one of the interesting aspects of this is that we don't really know what that looks like, what all those pathways might be. But that's precisely part of the path. It's because we don't always know what it looks like that we need to trust our hearts to keep us on that path of respect, dignity, mutuality, interconnectedness, reciprocity, the path of divine love. Whether it's science, scholarship, research, or other endeavors, all on a path of heart or led with heart, that has the potential to transform the world in ways that intellect alone does not. We need to include in our education programs the skills to know when you're operating through heart and when you're not. There are many simple ways to do this, easily taught and learned, and we've heard many of them in talks here on Humanity Rising before. I've used some of these techniques in the classroom, and students are amazed at the difference between intellect-only response and what comes out when they simply slow down and experience nature. So what if we taught science and research using techniques like this, bringing more of ourselves to the work, allowing our body minds, our hearts into the process? We need to teach this. We need to develop approaches to do so in ways that speak to scientists. And we need to ask scientists who have come to this balance themselves to speak up to help establish respect from the scientific world for other ways of knowing. We've made some progress, albeit little and spotty, with growing respect for traditional ecological knowledge. But we have yet to acknowledge other ways of knowing within all people. If this topic interests you, please consider connecting with us at heartforwardscience.org. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you a group of extraordinary scholars and friends. to discuss these ideas further, and each of them will introduce themselves and share some opening comments. Then we'll move into group discussion, and I hope that you'll join in that discussion by putting your questions into the Q&A chat. So at this point, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Anna Stewart Ibarra, who is the Scientific Director of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, which is an intergovernmental organization based in Montevideo, Uruguay. Dr. Stewart Ibarra's research focuses on understanding climate, environment, and social drivers of vector-borne diseases and other dimensions of human well-being in Latin America and the Caribbean. And for more than 13 years, she has collaborated with academic and government institutions in that region to conduct community-based social ecological, epidemiological, and modeling studies. So with that opening, Anna, would you please join us and share more about yourself and give your opening comments?
Good morning. Thank you, Valerie. Hey, good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone who's participating around the world. Thank you to the organizers of Humanity Rising for the opportunity to participate in this unique and meaningful space of global dialogue. My name is Anna Stewart Ibarra. In my current role at the IAI, my work is focused on supporting transdisciplinary scientific research and capacity building so that countries of the Americas are better able to make policy decisions to address the challenges posed by global social ecological changes, which we know are rapidly accelerating. Transdisciplinary means bringing together different academic disciplines like social and natural sciences together with non-scientists, community members, policymakers, and others who would participate and use the science that's produced. Prior to my current role, I led a research program on the ecology of mosquito-borne diseases and other infectious diseases in southern coastal Ecuador. I have had the great gift of spiritual teachers from the East and West who guide my work in the world and who have taught me how to integrate my mind, heart, and body. And I wanted to share briefly a few reflections that guide me as a scientist and as a human. So the Dalai Lama shared when he awakes that he is guided by two thoughts, and this is paraphrased certainly. First is that we are all interconnected. And in the book Interconnected by the 17th Karmapa, he shares this quote: "Turning our attention to the most basic condition for our life on this planet, the air we breathe, we see that we cannot be separated from our physical environment. Even if we could manage for some time without food or clothing, we cannot survive for more than a few minutes without oxygen. A vast number of conditions need to come together to yield the uninterrupted supply of oxygen that is indispensable to keep us alive. Yet we ourselves make no conscious effort to bring those conditions about. Contemplating this basic fact can spark a sense of wonder and gratitude toward the planet itself." So when we feel, and not just intellectually know, our interconnectedness, we can open ourselves to different ways of knowing, including knowledge that may flow from human and non-human beings to whom we are connected. The second thought that the Dalai Lama shared is his intention for the day, the intention to reduce the suffering of others, or at a minimum, not to increase the suffering of others. Before I do anything, I ask, what is my intention? This is the arrow that guides the trajectory of all that follows. My personal intention is to be of service, to reduce the suffering in the world. And yet in today's society, including in science, there's a subtle and not so subtle push for recognition, fame, funding, academic tenure, often resulting in a lack of caring and compassionate collaboration. This creates systemic distortion in people's actions, words, and in the incentive structures. And we need to profoundly shift this system if science is able to serve society. To bring my intention to bear, I have to be in alignment. And what do I mean by that? To be in alignment, I have to be settled and peaceful in my body, thereby allowing my thoughts, words, and actions to be coherent with my intention. This also allows for different ways of knowledge to emerge, including intuition, one of the themes of this panel. I am expecting the birth of my first child in 2 weeks, and my hope is that the world that he comes into is more loving, connected, conscious, and compassionate. This hope carries me forward. This conversation is urgent, and I am optimistic that together we are taking steps to evolve collectively towards a better humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So it is now my pleasure to introduce to you Bradley Parrish, who's a scholar practitioner currently based in Bali, Indonesia, and he's the founder of Nusa Knowledge Exchange. He spent a decade in academia studying, researching, and teaching environment and development, followed by a decade in practice in the field of sustainability-driven entrepreneurship. His most recent launch is Nusa Tonic Kitchen, conceived as a kitchen in service of people and planet. He's in the early stages of organizing a collaborative knowledge exchange initiative to democratize and diversify knowledge for wisdom and practice at nusawise.org. So welcome, Bradley, and please introduce and give your open comments.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Anna, for leading off. And I just want to give a very brief background about what kind of experience informs the opinions and thoughts that I'm going to be sharing with the group today. I'll keep it short because I really want to hear from others and engage in the discussion to see how we can move forward together with some of these ideas. But very briefly, the first 10 years of my professional career was spent in academia, studying, researching, and lecturing about environment and development. And specifically, I focused on market-based interventions for sustainable development. Now, over half of the Earth's population lives in democracies and in market-based economies. And so the idea being that it's quite important to think in democratic countries, in market-based societies, how can we use these mechanisms to move towards sustainability? And so in that early phase of my research and studies, looking at these market-based interventions, the conclusion that I came to, and that many others have come to as well, is that these positive social and environmental impacts you can get from, say, market interventions are contingent. So that means, it's possible, but it's not necessarily so. So there's no kind of natural law of the market that makes them work in harmony with society, with what the environment needs. But it doesn't happen by accident, but it can happen. And the way that it happens is by design. It happens with intentionality. And so based on that kind of insight, I then went on to look at sustainability-driven entrepreneurship. So I looked at entrepreneurs, the people in our market societies who are creating new organizational forms, creating new business models, new products, new services, saying what happens when these characters, these people playing these roles are driven by sustainability values? What happens when they're creating business models and products and services that are actually intended to not do less harm, but to actually support and improve and contribute to the health of the environment and society in a market-based earned income type enterprise? What would that look like? And so I researched that. I went in and I looked at how these types of entrepreneurs who have been successful actually did it. And for sure, they were value driven. They led with their hearts, in Valerie terminology. They were value driven, but it was more than that. The successful ones had this unique ability to balance competing interests. They were able to balance their own competing interests internally, because inside they cared about financial returns, environmental impacts, they cared about their employees, about customers. There's a lot of competing interests internally they were able to balance. They developed tools, they developed heuristics, frameworks that help them to balance these. And that is something that wasn't seen in other entrepreneurs. When you look at our received wisdom about business, about markets, it's about profit maximizing shareholder value. Maximizing is not balancing. And so there was something very unique about these value-driven entrepreneurs who were able to successfully balance competing interests. And it was fascinating from a kind of theoretical standpoint, but not being satisfied with that, because understanding that there are these different types of knowledge, and scientific knowledge, abstract, explicit, theoretical knowledge is one type, but there's also experiential knowledge, this kind of tacit knowledge, implicit knowledge that you only get from doing it in practice. And so I left my university post, and I came here to Indonesia and tried my hand at sustainability entrepreneurship. So that's what I've been doing the last 10 years. And it was challenging because at the time when I got started here, most of the players here, most of the markets, most of the potential customers did not have sustainability values that maybe myself and my team had brought through. And so, necessity is the mother of invention. So we worked our way through it, and we ended up developing an approach that I call building value coalitions. So it allowed us to work with a range of different people who didn't necessarily share our same values. And yet we were able to build coalitions of support where we could build in through our products, through our services, through our business models. We could develop things that served various interests, that were able to balance various values that people cared about, not just our own values, the values of other stakeholders too. And so this has kind of carried us through our endeavors in the last 10 years, my team and I, and it's worked out, and it's exciting, but I think it doesn't need to just be limited to private businesses into entrepreneurship. I think there's a role for this that is much broader. And so that's why recently we've started an early stage of a pilot project called Nusa Knowledge Exchange, where we're trying to, it's very small, but we're trying to work out in this small project some of these issues and see if they can work in a bigger scale, in a collaborative way. And so what we've done is we've taken, we started this in early April when the pandemic hit Indonesia, especially Bali, extremely hard. Bali's economy is based heavily on tourism, and the tourists stopped coming. So lots of unemployment, and we took some staff who didn't have work, and we put together a kitchen, and we said, all right, we're going to cook together, kind of a public kitchen. We're going to cook together, we're going to eat together, and we're also going to share the food with people in the community who are most vulnerable. And in discussions with village heads, that turned out to be elderly people with limited financial and family support. And so we started cooking, and we said, you know what, we're not going to just do that. We're going to turn the kitchen into a laboratory. And we are going to start developing food practices, we could say, recipes, ways of cooking, ways of dealing with the food that are going to be boosting the nutritional value as well as the ecological impact. And so this was a creative, collaborative endeavor that we worked together, and we used it based on evidence-based science. So the Eat Lancet Commission that issued the report about how the foods we choose lead not only to greater public health outcomes, but also to ecological sustainability outcomes. We use that as our basic framework. We filled in nutrition details from nutritionfacts.org by Dr. Greger, who's done a great job of bringing the scientific nutrition literature and making it accessible on his website. We use these scientific resources that already started the process of trying to make things accessible, and we took it the next step forward and said, let's start a creative process, as if we're developing products and services, but we're developing cooking and eating practices. And we're doing it together. That was the kind of explicit scientific knowledge. We also recruited the help of a retired warung owner. So warung is a local eatery here in Indonesia. She brought the experiential knowledge of Indonesian cuisine, how to cook from all over the different islands here. We've got our young staff who know nothing about cooking, know nothing about nutrition or ecology or sustainability. And we all came together in the kitchen and we started working through these things. We've been cooking, we've been eating what we've cooked, we've been sharing with the vulnerable folks in the community. We've been doing this for several months now, and we've been building up a repertoire of cooking and eating practices, you could say, with these sustainability values embedded in those practices. And this, I think, is the kind of example, a kind of sample, a kind of pilot that we're playing with to see how can there be this collaboration between science and different types of knowledge, experiential knowledge and other knowledge as well, which we can get into later when we talk, but I don't want to talk too long in the introduction. But just to give you an example, we're starting to play with these things and see how can science play a role, not the only role, but how can it play a role in a creative, collaborative knowledge exchange process where we come up with what in the old days maybe was called technology, but we could say social artifacts, practices that are embedded in culture, in society, built from the bottom up, informed by science, and hopefully will be useful for a very, much wider group of people. So those are some of the things that we've been doing here, trying to play with some of these ideas that we're talking about today. So got more that I could say, but I think that's enough.
Thank you, Bradley. Thank you so much. That's great. Well, at this time, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Chloe Erdmann, who is a nomadic feminist thinker. She is a thought leader on new frontiers for modern feminist theory and religious studies. She's a passionate theorist on nomadic theology with a deep affinity for goddess-related history. And she actively shares her ideas online and offline publications through speaking engagements. She's an intellectual explorer. And we have asked her to join us here today because she's also a person who questions and challenges boundaries. She's a collector of lost stories, and she's a link between all of this for us. She's a curious woman in love with the mysteries of the world. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us. And I invite you now to share your opening comments.
Sorry, there you go. My cousin helped me write that, who does marketing and branded me. When I hear it, it's a little embarrassing.
It's wonderful.
I'm a PhD candidate at UCC in Ireland, and my work is focused on the effects of a feminist goddess pilgrimage on women's agency, empowerment, and their spirituality. So twice a year, usually I go to Crete and go with groups of women through the caves and the mountains. And I see the effect of what rituals, even when people have different belief systems, what they do when you do rituals, which actually I was kind of thinking about what Bradley was saying, that small collaborative rituals like kitchen sharing in the material world and what that does. And I think it's something that requires collaboration between science, I guess you could say, what people consider sacred and the effect that has. And I think I am very honored to be here, by the way, and I'm not a scientist. I am a religious studies scholar. But I find this is probably one of the most important conversations for everyone on the third rock from the sun. So I am very humbled to be here. I don't have the background, I just in the sciences necessarily, but I think the study of what people consider to be sacred has an effect on the future. So if we think about what we sacralize in the world, it is what we will call forward. And that is something I am very interested in hearing what everyone here has to say about that. I also think nonviolent communication is key. And I know Valerie was talking about deep listening. And that is something, no matter what we're doing, I think everybody needs training in that. And that would help us to figure out what the needs are in the world and are required for us to keep living the way we are. I think I've studied a lot. There's a lot of metaphysical ways of viewing the world that clash. So I think the key is to find the values that we can agree on and share. And I think everyone has been touching on that. Like, we need clean water, we need the earth. So, you know, you think about like radical questions, like what if we had, oh, by the way, I want to do a land acknowledgement of the Onondaga nation that I'm on right now. I forgot to do that. I'm sorry. But I think opening with something like that, say the President of the United States opened with a land acknowledgement and then poured clean water, hopefully, onto the earth. I think rituals like that, even if people have a different metaphysical view, can bring people together. Like, we all need clean water, we need the earth, and that might actually change things drastically as a larger collective ritual. So those are things I'm thinking about, and mostly I'm listening here. So thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm going to be calling on you to make sure that you do more than just listen, because all of us bring all of ourselves to this work. And that's why you're part of this panel. And that balance is really, really key. So really appreciate your comments and opening as well. At this point, I'd like to introduce Daniela Manuschevich. And Daniela is joining us from Santiago, Chile. She is a Chilean scholar who loves to study trees in the forests, and she's a founding member of the Center for Environmental Analysis there in Santiago. She's a transdisciplinary scholar, and her passion for plants and forests led her to study biology. Later, she became interested in environmental policy, seeking to articulate alternative socio-political futures through maps and narratives. So stories here, and also alternative futures. So now she's working with peasant farmers, farmers living in the remaining native forest in the fringes of industrial tree farms. She's studying both the social and ecological aspects of environmental transformations in southern Chile. She's a founding member, as I mentioned, and an assistant professor at the Universidad de Chile. So welcome, Daniela. We look forward to your opening comments.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Valerie, for all the introduction. Well, it's very nice to see you all, and I'm very glad to be in this conversation. Yeah, as Valerie introduced me, I am a Chilean scholar. I was born in Chile. I went to study in the US, and then I came back, and now I'm teaching. Well, how to start? Well, I think I should start from the present. And well, right now I'm in Santiago. As everyone, we are in the middle of a pandemic, but we have a slightly different context. In October, there was what is called the social outburst, social uprising, something that we have never seen. I have never seen in my life. So people went out in the street protesting for a rise in the fare, which came into a more violent and really outgoing thing in the streets, with clashes with the police, very ugly things. That's probably what you have seen in the US recently. And why I'm commenting on this, because it's something that in a way my generation always felt that could happen. We are known in Latin America for being a very organized country, very structured, very able to follow rules, loving the rules, and this was something that we have never seen before. But it was a result of something that we all observed way before, which is inequality in so many different ways, which of course is also related to the environment. And as a Chilean, I always knew that the seed of inequality was so deep that something was going to happen at some point. But when I started in science, on one hand, I loved plants, but on the other hand, I felt that this inequality and the way that the society was organized wasn't socially sustainable even. So I decided to listen to myself and follow my curiosity and follow my heart and do something that makes sense to me. And what it did make sense to me is to start to mingle things, to start to take the biology, take the maps, and see how you can use your knowledge, all your knowledge, into foreseeing different futures. In southern Chile, there's one of the most aggressive extension of tree farms, which are basically clones of plants, and which have meant from violent conflict with indigenous people to peasants leaving their homes because the companies brought the land. So I knew that was there, and there was, of course, this is very profitable company, very profitable industry. So I was like, how I could imagine something that is different from what I see now. So I always strive for making science that makes sense, and how to connect that with science, how to connect that with the more classified scientific knowledge, right? So I developed scenarios, and what I like most about scenarios is like, okay, you perhaps don't like the world how it is, how we can imagine something that is different and something that is better. Because sometimes we are so focused on how things are bad, and what if we think about what do we want? What could be different? How do we make things different? Perhaps it won't happen now, but perhaps it might happen in the future. And after this whole social uprising, what happened is that we are going to have a change in the constitution, and people, in first time in the history of Chile, will decide the constitution. And this is an historic change that you have never would imagine 1 year ago. That would never have been possible. But because all the social uprising that happened, now it's possible. Sometimes we tend to think what is possible, and that is the realm of science, of like being in the reality. But really, is much more than that. Sometimes you can really mix science, quantitative things, with what you want, your imagination, through scenarios, through participation, talking to people, getting to know them, understanding what they want, what is the history of the place, and connecting all that pieces into something that might be different in the future. We don't know if that will happen or not, but we have to open the possibilities and not only being frustrated about what it is now and how things are not good enough now. So that's where I see the connection, where I see the role of science, the role of making sense of what we do, and having an impact, revealing what is wrong, but not only by describing it, oh, this is destroying the environment, this is that, but also through imagination, through using other skills, other tools, and more social science, mixing it into ecology and trying to think something different. And that is mostly what I do now. And my big message from Chile is that it might not seem possible, but at some moment it becomes possible. And you never know when that moment will be. It might be harsh, and it probably will be, but after that, you will transform yourself, the society transform into something different. And that's when change happens, and that's when things become different. So in Chile, at least, this is not resolved by all, and we have the referendum in October, and then it's a large process of discussion, but the things are there. The change could be possible, and I think never, the big message for me is never think something that never just forget about something because you think it's not possible. You never know when it'll become possible.
Thank you, Daniela. So thank you so much to everyone. So at this point, what I would like to do is invite you, all the panelists, to turn on your video screens and your microphones, and we'll begin the group conversation. So I put a quick note in the chat, and I just wanted to ask people that if you have ideas or thoughts for us, if you would put them in the Q&A chat, that will be easier for me to track, because the other chat goes too fast and I won't be able to keep up with that while we're here in this conversation. So to get us rolling, I want to thank you all for your really thoughtful comments in opening this up. And so it's obvious why I asked you all to join here today to have this conversation, because it's all these different thoughts and different ways of thinking about how we can bring this together. And each of us here do this in a little bit different way. And so what I'd like to do is just start with a question, and then I'd like to bring in some of the things that are coming from the Q&A, and sort of bring in from the audience some of the ideas and questions that are coming up. So I want to start with kind of a two-pronged question, which is, how do you see the role of science, scholarship, and knowledge in helping to bring us to a more equitable, sustainable world? And what kind of radical collaborations do you see that we might need to be able to do that? And I want to remind you, when I say this in terms of radical collaborations, I'm talking about those things that could be internally with individuals or externally together. So have at it. So what kind of collaborations do you see, and how do you see this helping us? Bradley, start us off. Great.
Well, I want to draw a little bit on what different things that people said too, as we to bring things together. It struck me when Elizabeth talked about the importance of nonviolent communication, and I think, to begin to answer your question that you posed, Valerie, I think in the spirit of nonviolent communication, recognizing the limits of science is part of the reason that it needs to collaborate. But at the same time, I think we need to begin by saying what's positive, what is useful about science, rather than just offering critiques. And I think, science has proven, as Jim said in the very beginning, it's very powerful. And its methods have really made an impact in society, for better or for worse. Lots of good, positive impacts as well. And the rigor of science, the fact that it comes down to being evidence-based, the fact that science itself is a radical collaboration. When the Royal Society in England first was chartered and founded, one of the stipulations was that research findings of the members had to be published publicly. Before that, everything was, private letters between scholars and researchers. The Royal Society said, no, these need to be published in an open public journal so that everyone can see it and everyone can know. That in itself is a radical collaboration, if you think about it. And if you think about the scientific pursuit, the fact of so many scientists in so many diverse fields interacting, peer-reviewed, co-working together, in its own way, it's already a radical collaboration. I think that's fantastic. But we have to look at, what Anna said, science should be in service of society. Otherwise, what is it there for? Right? If it's not serving society, why are we investing in it, and why is it there? And I think to start seeing how science can serve society, we need to also look at the limits of science and also the limits of the institutions of science. So, traditionally we say scientific institutions are there to generate new knowledge and to disseminate that. And, I think there's been a very strong emphasis on the generation of knowledge, maybe not so strong on the dissemination of knowledge throughout society. Knowledge seems to go to very narrow areas, either formal education or experts in some profession or power brokers. And a thought that I wanted to throw out to the group to answer your question is, as I said, over half of the world lives in a democracy now. Half of the human population lives in a democracy. And philosophers of old agreed amongst themselves that the ideal form of government would be one run by a philosopher king, or we could say philosopher queens as well, would be possible, right? So those would be kings or queens who bring wisdom and benevolence to their societies. In a democracy, we're not ruled by kings and queens. It's the citizens who have the power. And so if knowledge is going to be concentrated in expert elite classes, that's not serving society well. That knowledge that is generated has to be spread to the citizenry. We need not philosopher kings and queens, we need philosopher citizens, which means not philosophy, of course, in the abstract sense, but it means citizenry who knows how to use wisdom and benevolence. And if this is an important goal for us, then we have to think, what role does scientific knowledge play in developing citizenship that is benevolent and that is wise? And to start to answer that, we can look at the different types of knowledge. And we already started by saying, there's science excels in the explicit knowledge. And it's been known for a long time, there's also this implicit, this kind of tacit knowledge that can't be codified. It's experiential knowledge. Both of those have to do with the outer world. There's a whole realm of inner knowledge that is not addressed in any way in science, which is equally valid. And in fact, it's this inner knowledge, this philosophical knowledge, the knowledge of self, which has other knowledge traditions building into it. That's where the wisdom and where the benevolence comes. And so if we're going to talk about radical collaborations with science, I think, one, we need to appreciate what science has to offer, but I think scientists also need to appreciate these other knowledge traditions and what they have to offer. And this sort of humility and mutual respect would be the basis of fruitful collaborations going forward, opening up new possibilities so we could imagine new scenarios together, as Daniela was talking about.
Thanks, Brad. Someone else?
Oh no, I shut down the conversation.
I'll make a quick comment, building on Brad's comments as well. Just having been in the field of science for a while, science is a very powerful tool, but it can be wielded for many different ends. And I think that's critical. Science is not good or bad per se. And so as I mentioned in my opening comments, the outcomes of what we do really depend on what is our intention. Do we know how to state an intention? Scientists are not trained in this and thinking about what is your intention, And so this is really, really critical because everything that we do afterwards follows from our initial intention. And so coming from the field where I was for the last 7 years in Biomedical Research Institute, a medical school in the US, I can say that scientists are not trained often in asking these questions in an explicit way. And we need a lot more training in ethics and self-reflection and thinking about intention. And so when people in academic research are doing biomedical research, is the goal at the end of the day to make more money for big pharma, or really is it to make people healthier through low cost and accessible medical tools? And from what I've observed, science funding often from the private sector is insidious. And again, this is not often explored or looked at in an explicit manner, especially by the universities that rely on this funding to keep the motor going of academic research. So we talked about, I think both Valerie and I mentioned that there are sort of systemic issues with the academic scientific model. And this is one of those, there are others, but certainly this is something that raises major red flags. And obviously then the cascading effects for who we're working with, how we're engaging, what are the power dynamics of the communities that we're working in, have major implications that we need to look at the origins though, and the intention, sort of that seed from why we're doing everything that we're doing that comes after that.
Yeah, Anna, thank you. And I will add to that some of the systemic issues within science include that in some ways it's based on fear. It's based on competition. It's based on this idea of you can't remain what you're doing, publish or perish, just this idea of that, just so we say that if you don't publish, you perish. So that's just really limiting the aspects of what we can bring to the system as well. Daniela, Elizabeth? Daniela, you're muted.
Yeah, I would just like to add, seconding what Hadley say, is that I think that the political economy of science is really important. As Anne said, science, and Bradley will say, science is an excellent tool, but it does depend on what you want to do with it. And the mistrust in science that we see today is partially related to what has been used for the science. And there are reasons why people is not trusting anymore science. And I think as we need to take care of that. We need to listen why people is not trusting it, and being more, as Anna also say, reflective on what we are using the science for. And I would say that even in environmental problems, it's even more wicked, because you could say like, okay, so we are producing too much trash. Simple example, right? And of course you could say, and there's probably a lot of evidence that poor people produce less trash than rich people. But then you can have a fixing of, I don't know, some technology that just will fix the trash problem. And you just put on the table the social problem that is related to trash production. And I think that is really wicked, because really, if you need to be very conscious about, yes, you want to have less trash in the world, of course, but how much responsibility you are not taking and relying on technology. So now everyone is waiting for the vaccine as is will solve all the inequality problems and just get back to normal, right? Because that was the problem. The problem is the virus. But the virus has been a flashlight to just pointing all the problems that we have in the society. And the technology won't solve it. It will just like solve a small part of it. And then we will just forget. I mean, my question is more rather than a question of like, oh, so after we have the vaccine, if we have it, let's just get back to normal. What is that normal, and how do we question that? And I agree also that we deeply need more training into the reflective production of knowledge. What are we producing? For whom are we producing? How are we producing the knowledge? And that is something that we are, I would say, all universities in the world in depth. And if we don't consider that, the role of science as a whole in the world is becoming less important, which is very worrisome, because it's an excellent tool. Just wanted to point that.
Thank you, Daniela. Elizabeth, comments from outside of science, from your perspective. You're on mute still.
Oh, I mean, everything that I kind of am agreeing with everything everyone's saying, and I'm reading the comments from the people listening, and it's just so brilliant. It's really inspiring. Everyone's into indigenous and lucid dreaming, and I was kind of thinking, if people, they probably here already know about Vandana Shiva in India, and how I think that was a good example of combining some of the indigenous wisdom and science and getting Monsanto out of there. And you know, she kind of points out some of the gendered politics in her book Staying Alive. And I'm just going to read one of them because it just blows my mind. But most food producers, farmers in the world are women, and most girls are future farmers. They learn the skills and knowledge of farming in fields and farms. Women also produce more than half of the world's food and provide more than 80% of the food needs in food insecure households and regions. So like, I kind of feel like that's a good example of, you know, having small gardens is actually kind of, you know, it's a revolution. And how that also was from, you know, knowing the indigenous knowledge. I was in India briefly and working with the Adivasi there, which are the indigenous people that in the forest. And it was, what I saw was like a many layered problem that people, and I think good people, you know, were donating bags of white rice to feed people because they didn't have food. But it was just a matter of giving them back their ancestral forests and letting them do their amazing farming techniques that they were doing for thousands of years. And, you know, when you see that, like that would take, now it takes both scientists and like understanding, you know, social scientists, all that combined. Like, I don't think anyone is not involved, you know, lawyers, everybody. And I don't know, looking at those examples around the world is really inspiring. But also part of that is people recognizing the sacred again, because that was key in that as well. And, you know, you look at Ayurvedic knowledge, like that came from the Adivasi, and it came from them living in the forest every day, 24 hours, like Valerie and her forested canopy. Like that's where the knowledge came from, not from in a classroom. So I think that is, you know, what we're discussing here, but that takes a change of the values and recognizing different life worlds and what will actually let us survive as people. I wanted to hold up some books because I heard some people original instructions.
Yes.
This one, that's and then I know the braiding sweetgrass, but one you might not know of, and this is actually I'm part of, is a really great thing, and everyone is welcome to be part of. It's out of UCC in Ireland, and marginalized and endangered worldviews, which is, you know, valuing the indigenous wisdoms. So I think that's my comment.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So, you know, the indigenous is a really important connection. And I think that's something that's been an important part of this. And as I mentioned, traditional ecological knowledge is one of these forays into other ways of thinking that has been, that we stepped into from the formal scientific community, at least a little bit. And I think that that question, there's some really good questions that have come up on the Q&A that I want to pose here. And so what I'll do is I'll toss out a couple of different things here from the Q&A, and then we can pick up on parts of them as we want. So Kurt Kruger writes, futurist thinking, how would we design a full world society modeled after Mother Nature? And then another question that's come up is, in what ways can science help humanity to move beyond what is commonly called various dogmas? And I will say to that, I'll add to that, that I think this question of how we bring in differing value systems to all of this is really challenging. And so what are your thoughts about how we can move in this direction? I think the other piece that keeps coming up that I see popping up in the chat here and there is, it's not just an informed citizenry, but it's the idea of understanding that within us we hold knowledge that is also important. That science is not an elitist. Science, I think, is an elitist form of knowledge as it's understood within science. And the question of how do we balance that with other things, and how do we make those inroads between science and other ways of knowing in both directions? So, comments, thoughts?
I think from what I've heard from the conversation so far, to answer your question, you know, how can we start making those inroads and bring it together? I've heard suggested, one from me and one from Elizabeth, two possible suggestions. From my experience, this creative collaboration in a creative endeavor is a way to bring lots of things together. Is a way to start mixing values. It's a way to start learning together. It's a way to start opening our minds together, and doing that not in the sense of, you know, oh, I'm going to tell you what I think, my dogma, you tell me your dogma, let's decide which one is right and which one is wrong. Very limited. But when there's an actual task at hand, there's a creative role. Creativity in itself, by its nature, takes us out of the box. You know, it takes us out of the boxes we're in. You know, creative problem solving, design thinking, there's all sorts of great tools that can be used for creativity, but it takes us out of our boxes, and we have to go out of our boxes to do it. And so to have a concrete creative problem that needs to be solved in a collaborative effort, I think is a great way of learning together and starting to reflect on what values and dogmas we're bringing and how that matches and dismatches with others. So that's one idea, is, you know, working on creative projects together. And then I heard another idea from Elizabeth, which would be interesting to hear more about, but the idea that perhaps performing rituals together would be a way for this to happen, even if we're bringing different values and different meaning systems, but just through that, and when you say ritual, I think in terms of sociology, in terms of practices. So just engaging in that shared practice could be something that allows us to move beyond our usual boundaries. So I don't know if Elizabeth, sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have more to say about that, I'm really curious to hear. Maybe Anna and Daniela have other ideas too.
I would, yeah. Oh, no, go ahead. You go ahead.
No, you can go.
No.
So Daniela, then Elizabeth.
Yeah, I want to say something that could be radical, but I sometimes wonder about this different values. Yes, it's important to have, it's like the balanced view on the news. Like I will put someone who thinks this and will put someone who thinks that. And something in the middle is the truth. And I think that view not always has brought us to the best outcome because things are unbalanced. And if we just bring into the table someone who has a lot of power and a lot of money and a lot of knowledge and, I don't know, a farmer, the truth is not in the middle. And so I wonder what I think it's important to discuss about what we mean by different values, because I think there has to be a minimum in the table, and that is common life for everyone. That is not everyone killing each other. It's kind of minimum things. And what we are seeing in the world today is not like moving towards that. And that's a question for me. What I have been what I have seen in Chile is that a new generation of scientists working in different areas had a very different mindset about their own knowledge. They are way more open to discuss with everyone. They were more humble. There's a different position in how you stand over what you know. In the older generation, I just say kind of the old school. And I also feel that, again, speaking in Chile, what we need more rather than the government listen to the science, which has been very difficult in many sense, is some sort of alliance between citizens and scientists, because the new generation of scientists are quite open for that alliance, but we need to push for us in the government to be listened. And by yourself, we will not do it. And I think my generation is very conscientious about that, or not, well, somehow more conscientious about that. But it's not that because we are scientists, they are going to listen us in the government. It's not like that, at least here. So I think the way of working, the thing about science and values, it depends a lot on the context too. Whether you have a government that is very open and transparent, information is shared and produced, and everyone has a good like science-related formation from the school to the university, or whether you have a society where people barely read well and have a lot of distrust, and the government don't want to listen. So it depends a lot on where you start, and that's my point of like bringing different values. It depends a lot on the context, how you bring them in. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Danae. Elizabeth?
I agree. Like, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question: how to bring the values in. And I kind of agree with it starts in these small, I think in these small groups, and then they get larger and they spread. Not to get us off track or anything, but I find it fascinating that the witch hunts for that, were very like whatever 90,000 is what the historians say now, between 1350 and 1650 were accused of witchcraft. It did not stop with legislation. It stopped with belief. And well, then it went elsewhere. But the point being, like, I think I don't know if we can do this. I think someone was talking about top down or bottom down. I kind of think it's from small groups spreading. Personally, that's what I see in, I know it's a small group of 20 women in Crete with the goddess pilgrimages, but it was something to see rituals done in the landscape that were simple, were so profound. And people argued like about what they believed, about all their different beliefs, but a simple ritual of pouring things out onto the ground and calling on their ancestors, just people who had died in their family. It doesn't have to be ancestor worship, was powerful. And I kind of think, you know, working in the kitchen, like those kind of things. And I see like science, like sharing that knowledge with people who are not going to understand all the technical terms is huge. So I would say the power of ritual is a form of resistance. And, you know, I kind of see like the different terms have been worked through: resistance, sustainability, resilience, and maybe we're at reimagining because maybe we have lost a lot and maybe we have to actually kind of go back in a new way. I don't know. I don't know if those terms are helpful, but it's interesting because I think resistance is that you have it still, and sustainability is that you have it still, and resilience is to be flexible, but maybe we have lost so much that we have to reimagine, and that is part of this and what we're doing here. Sorry, I'm kind of but I do think simple rituals are really powerful, and that is, you know, in anthropology, that is how you pass on knowledge. You actually, oral traditions are more sustainable than written ones. So it's important to know that, and like what Danielle was saying, like you never know when something's possible, and I think that I agree with that.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. You know, I just wanted to say a couple of things. I mean, from what I've been hearing here and some of the stuff popping up in the chat, I think this is exactly what we're doing, is reimagining what science can be and how it can connect. And so some of the things that some of you have all said, I just want to take a moment and reiterate some of these phrases that have come up. So the power of ritual as a form of resistance, I mean, that's a really interesting thought. And part of the chat, something came up in the chat of this idea of ritual-based, that would that be accepted by people? Well, this is really interesting question, Foundation. And so it brings to mind this notion of course, the importance of gratitude as a foundation for all of this as well. And I wonder, what would it look like to have intention-focused, gratitude-based science?
Well, you know,
the thought of gratitude-based science goes back to this initial reflections of interconnectedness, which I think is probably foundational to any or most spiritual traditions around the world, especially indigenous traditions, right? Knowing that we depend wholly on the earth that we're in and around, the water, the air, the food, and then how everything that we do comes after that, right? So, but it's not just understanding this in an intellectual way, it's the heart, it's the feeling. And that's where, again, going to Elizabeth's comments, think different actions such as ritual, different practices can help us to move towards that feeling of interconnection. Because today, and Robin talks about this in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, we face a challenge in the US where it's a settler society, where most people don't feel indigenous to the land, they don't feel this connection. Or there's this sense that we're not really going to stay here long term. And so how that changes how we interact and the decisions we make in the land that we live in has radical implications. And if we are able to shift towards feeling indigenous to the place that we live in, that could radically shift the science that we do, how we interact with each other, and how we interact with all also non-human beings of the land.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, these thoughts are really, really key. And I think what we're starting to come to is thinking about how do all of these parts connect. And so it's really interesting. We're at the beginning stages within science in terms of actually connecting some of these parts. And it's still considered fringe in so much of traditional science. And so I wonder about this. And this is why part of what I have been saying is I think we need to start talking about this more freely and more openly. And so as a scientist, one of the things that I did when I started thinking about this, and when I had the personal intuition coming to me, I examined that. I did what a scientist would do, is I investigated it. And so the first thing that comes up is that you can't externally validate intuition. So therefore we can't include something like that. So that's always, but I had decided to look into that further. And I started exploring the mystery schools of old and current mystery schools. And I, in fact, have pursued those studies over the last several years. And it's actually not true. It's actually true that intuition can be validated by others. It's not done in the same way we do it in science. And so it's a matter of, again, expanding the way in which we think about what we do, how we do it, and learning about how that happens in other ways of knowing. So we have a particular way of doing something in science, and that's been incredibly valuable and taught us so much of this. And so much of these other ways of knowing also can be validated and verified. And so that in of itself is a topic that could be a very big conversation. But I'm not sure we're ready to go there, because what we're really at this point trying to figure out, how do we make some of these connections that we've got? Go ahead, Brad.
I have a question for you based on what you just said. I'm interested. Do you think, so if this, validated intuition and the methods to do that are something worth exploring and worth pursuing, and the value that could, the knowledge that could come out of that could be a different type of knowledge of a different order that's useful. Do you see that as something being incorporated in science, or would that be a kind of separate, institution, artifact of society that would then collaborate with science? Thought about that relationship?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, so Brad, sometimes your sound bounces in and out, so we're kept getting most of what you say. But so I think to answer your question, I think it might be both of those things. So I think that by becoming more cognizant and knowledgeable about other ways of knowing, and that the fact that there is some level of validation in its own right with respect to intuition, that may be something that provides some level of entree for people who are only willing to understand scientific validation. And so the connection of that, but certainly collaborations. But so as an individual, I have pursued both of these areas. So I've pursued both of these fields. I've pursued a mystic approach to the world and education, and I've pursued a scientific education. And now this is the first time that I'm publicly actually speaking about these two things at the same time. And so the question is how to do that while maintaining credibility in the scientific world. That this is not something I would have done earlier in my career because of the issues that are associated with this. It's why I didn't say anything about what happened when I was in the old growth forest. I didn't really know about that. I've learned a lot since then. So I think it's both of those things. I think it's all of that. And it's something that we have to figure out how to bring together. I think a lot of the questions that are coming up about how do we connect with citizenry. So if I'm looking at the Q&A, and I want to bring in some of that. So democracy relies on educated people, which sounds like what we were talking about, citizens of wisdom that you were talking about, Bradley. But our educational system's not producing them. And so that's part of what I'm talking about here, is about the educational system and how do we educate in a way that we bring value to both of these things without it being dogmatic, which is another comment that I've seen come up and I think is incredibly important as well. And so these are kind of new territories that we're talking about here. So how do we begin to make these headways and maintain the credibility as scientists that we have as we do it, or as scholars?
I'm particularly myself interested in this concept of wisdom, because it seems like it can provide a way in from many different angles. In the sense, we talked about different values. And I think if you talk with just about anyone on the planet and you ask them, is wisdom something good? Is that something that we should strive for? It's hard to imagine anyone on planet Earth saying, no, I think wisdom is not a useful thing and it's not worth something striving for. So automatically, although we might have different ideas of exactly what wisdom means, it's something that's already, I think, a shared value. We think it's good to have as an individual and as a society. And looking at then at wisdom, wisdom doesn't necessarily have to be based on scientific knowledge. In fact, wisdom wouldn't even be primarily maybe based on scientific knowledge. And if we think about educating for wisdom, I don't think we would also think about limiting that to formal education. That would be a lifelong learning and education process. And so it starts getting at some of these issues that I think we're talking about. There's a Cornell psychologist, Sternberg, who has a very interesting model of wisdom. And he looks at wisdom as balance, as intrapersonal balance. So balancing our own different interests that we have, even for ourselves, as interpersonal balance, balancing, our own self-interest with the common good. And I don't know if he uses exactly this term, but what I would call, intertemporal balance, looking at our immediate interests versus long-term interests. And doesn't this ring the bell of sustainability? I mean, we're thinking about equity. We're thinking about, ethics, ourselves and others. We're talking about intergenerational equity. We're talking about, immediate goods and long-term goods. And so for me, I'm getting more and more captivated by the potential that framing these types of issues around the idea of wisdom might have, because it pulls in sustainability, it pulls in the different types of knowledge, the personal knowledge. It could be the use of rituals. It could be, how citizens are educated and for a lifelong kind of personal development type of education. And it seems like it could be something, that can pull people together and make a starting point for these
We looks like we lost Danny here. Maybe she'll come back in.
things.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
I love the idea of wisdom, and I kind of think places we can find common ground are super key. So that's one that, finding things that don't offend, it's really, really important. The thing you said about balance, Bradley, is like, that's found in a lot of indigenous cultures. And Anna mentioned alignment, and I just wanted to ask a specific question, like, of Anna, like when you talk about alignment being so key in your own work, can you share with us something that you do in order to keep that, maintain that as a scientist? I'd be very interested.
Meditate, breathe, draw on my practices from different teachers, right? And the many different traditions. With just your alignment starts with your central column, with your spine. So being able to sit in alignment. And a lot of this, I'm grateful, many of my teachers are very body-centered, somatic, and they bring together the divine with somatic work. But being able to feel that alignment and that settledness in the body, I think is so important before we do anything else. And I actually think this is they're talking about education. This is something that little children should know from day one. Before we learn, other things, we should know what does it mean to feel settled in our body and in alignment. And that's something that shockingly I've had to learn as an adult. And I wonder why this isn't like when we brush our teeth, we learn to brush our teeth, and we should learn how to feel that, right, in our bodies at all times, because then we can act and speak and be in the world in a way that really is driven by whatever those foundational ethics are that we share, that we've all been talking about, that Danny mentioned as well.
I think I saw a quote by James Madison, if I'm not mistaken, that said, we need two kinds of education. We need one kind of education to teach us how to do work. And we need another kind of education that teaches us how to live. And it sounds like that's, the type of education that you're talking about. Something that maybe...
Whether you keep fading in and out with your sound, maybe you can disconnect your headset, maybe that would work. Maybe that's the issue, I don't know.
Is that better? Usually
So far.
Okay, that's good. That's all I wanted to say.
Maybe you could just repeat that last little bit, just so that we get the whole thing, Bradley.
Oh, yeah, just, I think it was Madison, I saw a quote that said, we need two kinds of education. One kind of education to teach us a profession to work, and another kind of education that teaches us how to live. And it seems like, that is something that traditional cultures did very well, that our modern culture and our modern society has kind of forgotten about. And it sounds like those are the types of things that Anna is talking about. And
Okay, let's have a look at Q&A and see where we are. With some other questions have come up. So questions about education, questions about how, so this is a question here that COVID seems not to care about our values or dogmas or rituals in the US. And we seem to have a president and administration does not appear to value science. And that is in a context with COVID. Can scientists view themselves as those who are simply trying to figure out the best way to engage with it so that it does not do more harm? That's to the human body. So it's an interesting question, that question about how we are at the moment dealing with how science is understood in the world. And it's not the same everywhere. We don't have the same interaction with how we understand science right now. In fact, in our conversation prepping for this, Daniela, I think you were saying something about science being not as accepted in a certain way. And Anna, you're saying a different experience where you were on that. Maybe you want to share a little bit about that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yep.
Yeah. So do you mean the relation between like people accepting science, people trusting science, or?
Sure,
Yeah,
and
both.
governments too.
Yeah, well, this part I will talk on my own experience in Chile. Can you hear me? I did. Yeah, good. What I see here is that at the government level, no, science is not very at the core of how decisions are taken, and the pandemic has been a good example. Although in the public discourse, they say that they use it and they listen and all of that. But no, not really. And at the level of lay people, it's kind of a weird relationship because, well, I would say in the city, people believe in science in general terms, but there is also all this rise into, for example, that the virus is result of I don't know, that you can cure the virus by using vinegar or things like that, and people actually believe in that.
Looks like Daniela broke up again, but she made her point, I think. Valerie, you muted now.
Thank you, Gary. Anna, do you want to pick up a little bit about your thoughts about how science is understood there, or how people interact with it and governmentally?
Sure, I'll make just brief comments. I'm in Uruguay right now, which is a small country of 3 million people in the southern cone of South America, next door, or pretty close to where Daniela is in Chile. But our experiences have been quite drastically different in the countries. So here we've had relatively few cases of COVID. The government took action very quickly. Within a day or so of the first 3 cases being reported, everything was basically shut down, and they've been able to control the outbreak, and we've had very few deaths and again very few cases. And so that has actually resulted in increasing credibility of the government and a pretty tight linkage between science advisors and the government, because the new president had just entered in early March, and the first cases of COVID were reported about 2 weeks later. So it seems to be creating a space and an opportunity for science and scientists and science advisors to reach and engage with the government. And the question is now, how can this be carried forward into other realms, such as sustainable fisheries or climate change, or managing agriculture in better ways? Can we really develop and deepen the partnership, this space that's open during COVID?
Valerie, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. So earlier, one of the questions that had come up was, we were talking about values, and a specific question has come up, Bradley, asking about what you meant when you were talking about sustainable values. And if you would talk a little bit more about sustainable values. You're muted.
There we go. Well, when I talk about sustainable development, I'm not talking about, sustained unending economic growth. When I talk about development, what I personally mean by it, and of course, everyone I'm sure has a different meaning by it, but development for me means improving the quality of life on Earth. That for me, that's what it's about. That's what we're trying to do. We're all living here on Earth together, and how can we go forward together so that we improve the quality of life on Earth? And how can we sustain that going forward? And so for me, that encapsulates what I think of when I think of sustainability and sustainable development. It's about actually caring about people, caring about what happens to them now, and caring about what happens to them in the future, caring about all sorts of living beings, not just people, but life on Earth and the quality that we have of life on Earth. And given that we are, semi-intelligent beings who can, imagine, who have foresight, who can evaluate what is useful, what is not useful, what is helpful, what is harmful, we should put those to good use for ourselves, and we should put those to good use for other living beings as well. And I think, if you look again at ancient wisdom philosophy, it was Socrates' philosophy was described as, in a nutshell, saying that care for the self is actually care for others. And this keeps coming up, whether you're quoting the Dalai Lama, whether you're quoting Socrates, and I'm sure many other traditions and cultures in the world, it keeps coming up again and again and again that, caring for self is caring for others. We're in this together. And that's what I mean by sustainability-driven value, personally.
Thank you, Brad. So other comments, other thoughts? Again, hopefully Daniela will be able to join us in again.
I just want to, I don't know if this would be useful for scientists, but extraordinary anthropology and sensual scholarship allows working with different epistemologies, which I think is kind of what we're facing as well with different values, because indigenous values are different from what we see. So it allows, it's kind of a methodology that allows for that, because obviously the methodology, not all scientists are going to agree on that. So what Bradley's saying about, other species, so if you have to like tear off a monkey's head to find something, that's a question of ethics, not science, like at what length, which would be very different from indigenous value, because like watching something in its natural habitat would have a very different knowledge. But I also want to throw another book up that is one of the most important things I've read in a long time, Decolonizing Trauma Work by Renee Linkletter. I don't know if people might have, I found it. But I think that one really questions like decolonizing even things that we, psychiatry. And she gives a great example of indigenous cultures, like naming is really important. So if you call somebody a schizophrenic, they're going to take that name on. And that could be really detrimental because you become the name, you don't necessarily heal from the name. And I mean, she goes into more details and there's more examples, but like we start to see like, well, what are the values within science and ethics can be very different, and like to really bring them out. I mean, not that we're going to agree on that, but decolonizing I think is key for everything. So I would say like using different methodologies would help with that. That that include everything that Valerie was saying with heart center and alignment, and so.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, for that. The decolonization idea. So there's some really great work on indigenous research methods for scientists. And that actually brings in the idea of intention, and it brings in relationship as well as naming issues. And so it's a really interesting, different process than what we are traditionally teaching about how to do research, and moving in that direction could really be an interesting way to assist in making some of these changes in that regard. Anna, were you going to jump in? Okay. So, checking the chat here. All right. So a question has come up asking, do we think there should be a special field of science, translational science, where people are taught to how to explain to the common people what the scientists and science are saying? And, this is a good question in so many ways. And in fact, there's been a great deal of attention to science communication and communication for scientists in recent years, because trying to understand how do we tell the stories of science, how do we talk about science as well. But Bradley has had some interesting thoughts in terms of the sharing of scientific knowledge with others and putting it to use. Do you want to share some of that, Brad?
Well, it's interesting. It is a great question, and I think it takes us from very kind of stiff early on ideas of what it means to share scientific knowledge into a much more nuanced idea. The old idea being that we have to knowledge transfer, right? There's people who know, and we need to transfer it to those who don't know, and that's a one-way street, and that's how it works. And I think luckily, we've gotten a lot more sophisticated over time, and there's a more nuanced view. But it can be interesting if you look at this, say, from literary studies, right? In literary studies, we've got a text, right? We could think of a scientific fact as being like a text, right? Here's a statement, a scientific statement of fact. With that fact, with that statement, there is always context, right? Who's saying it, to who, under what conditions, for what reason, what's the intent behind it? So there's context, but there's also intertextuality, as they call in literary studies. So it's also, when a scientific fact is stated in a research paper, for example, there are citations, it draws on previous work, it explains what following work could be, it draws on concepts that are shared within the community. And so within the scientific community, the context has a certain meaning, the intertextuality has a certain meaning. There's also subtext, right? Which is what is not stated in the text, but is still communicated. So when we talk about, humans as being material beings, when the mind is reduced to the brain and to neuroscience, and that's all that it is, that has a certain subtext to it. It's devaluing something, it's removing something from the experience of people. So if we take, that and we say, oh, I'm going to tell you scientific facts, and we bring it across cultures, across language barriers, even within one culture and within one language, someone who hasn't been part of that sense-making process and that process of interpretation, and we suddenly put it in a totally different context with the subtext, with its own intertextuality, the meaning becomes something totally different. And I think, it's not simply a matter of, oh, we need to translate science from a scientific journal into something, an 8th grade reading level that people can read. And I think that's way too simplistic about what it's about. And again, I think that's why here in our project here with the kind of food and eco-sustainability and nutrition, that communication is happening for us as part of the creative process. So it's not, if I walked in and said, oh, by the way, they said the scientists tell us we need to do this in order to be healthy, and we need to do this in order to have good ecosystems. What does that mean? What does that mean, right? So that means something to me, but it doesn't necessarily mean something to the other people that I'm working with. And so I can bring that meaning for myself to the table. This is what, again, talking about values. I value that. I value what it does to the ecosystem. I value that it's nutritious for people because I don't want people to get cancer and diabetes. I value that. I bring my values. Other people value other things. Other people value a really delicious dish. I want it to be delicious. Oh, I want it to be something from my community. Oh, I want it to be cheap and affordable. I want it to be something that I can grow in my garden. We're all bringing our values to this and we're saying, okay, great. What do we have here? And what can we create with this? How can we put it together? And so that's where we're starting to see this translation of science happening and saying, oh, and of course the words, the names we give are important. So I have found it's not useful to say that, oh, this is healthy. We talk about it being a complete and balanced meal. We're creating complete and balanced meals, and that's the way we name it, and that works for people. And and we do things. So language is important, naming is important, but it's not just about language. It's much more about the webs of meaning and significance that we bring into these things. So there's different ways to do it. Our way is a specific way, but easy.
Yeah, so your way, Bradley, of doing this through the action in the kitchen, in those small groups, and as Elizabeth was saying, in these small groups that we start to operate, I think this is one of the things. And there are lots and lots of small activities around the world where people are operating with local currencies, with different bartering systems, with different kinds of, ethical marketing opportunities, with all kinds of small group activities that are helping to move us in this direction. So at this point, I'm having a look at our time here, as I really want to thank everybody for this conversation. And I would like to invite each of you panelists, if you would, to share with us sort of a closing thought. And we'll finish up with some closing thoughts. So, shall we go in the
I can
order?
go.
Okay, and Danny, thank you. All right.
I can go. Well, I mean, what come up after all this conversation and interaction and exchange is this idea of like a sum of new agreement or how we rebuild trust, so that it's not only is that science listen to people and people also believe in science, and there is a meaningful exchange of knowledge that actually moves forward. So for that, I think we need a few things. On one hand, science needs to be more reflective, and I fully agree with Anna say, like, how do we actually do it? By being there at every moment that we are doing actually the research, by being present, by feeling what we are doing, by listening what people say. That is one key step. Also teaching, training people to I teach to people more related to social science and also to people more related to natural science. And in both places I play the advocate devil, say that for the scientists, like, oh yeah, how do you know that is not how do you know your own interest in that? And for the social scientists, say, like, how are you going to measure it? So to trying to bridge that forward in a way that we have good quality science and good and reflexive science. I feel that's the key word here. We want to use science, but being so aware at every moment for what we are going to use it, it's extremely important. And that is at every level. It's not just writing the big grant and super paper, but it's like asking a simple question. For what are you going to use it? And make that a sort of habit, of constant thing. Second, I do feel that someone asked about how we make people interested in science. And first of all, I feel that we need to like not put it that in the ivory tower is like, oh, science is far away from me. It's like a way of knowing. It's how you make question and how you want to understand something. It's just like simple and easy. And how you motivate people is just by getting their curiosity in. Oh, by observing people and finding what they like, why they're interested. And just will put one example because I was just teaching a few minutes ago. So I noticed that, well, it had been very hard for me to teach in the middle of the pandemic. I'm teaching a public university. Some students are having a really hard time. They don't have space, don't have internet connection. Some of them have to take care of kids, their own children. It's really hard. And it was kind of very tense at the beginning because they felt that this wasn't important. So I tried to think how make them interested in this. So I decided to teach them or to have like a parallel session or space where we can discuss how to grow plants in quarantine. So that is actually something applied that makes sense to them. And in that way, bring them to the ecology and bring them to why this is important and why this is useful for you. But you need to really observe what people is interested in and try to link it with what you know. And that's how we will get people interested in science. They might become scientists, they might not become scientists, but they will be always interested in learning. And I think that's really what we can do as teachers. We will not be able to teach them all that things that we know because it's impossible, but we can raise that curiosity. And that curiosity is, I feel for me, it starts with my own observation of what the other is interested in.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you. Anna?
Sure. I think my reflection is, again, science is a tool, and, you know, I think we need to not take ourselves so seriously all the time. And that's about having our egos go down and being able to laugh at ourselves, and also to really value all of these experiences that probably most of us have had outside of the realm of science, and to know that these are, whether it's in dreaming, in walking through the woods, in meditation, in different spaces, that those are valid and important, and they're not antagonistic, that they go hand in hand. You know, our spiritual life, our different ways of knowing is complementary and can balance and go with science rather than being at odds with science. And that's our challenge. And being able to do that in an open way, that it, like Valerie said at the very beginning of this panel, that we don't have to be fragmented beings, that we can, you know, bring our full self to the table. But I think bringing our full self to the table also requires this kind of rebalancing and being able to recognize, you know, that science is not the end all, and that we have more parts of us, and being able to recognize that in bringing our humor to bear on our, you know, to ourselves as fallible and imperfect humans, and that's a wonderful thing. So I'll close with that.
Thank you, Anna. Bradley, a final thought?
Okay, thanks. I think very briefly, you know, based on what I've heard from everyone here and the ideas that you've stimulated me from your comments, you know, there's been talk about science as this outward body of knowledge, and there's been talk at different levels of our kind of inner knowledge. And I think it's become very clear to me in our conversations how, you know, they're not the same thing, but science can be enhanced when we lead with our inner knowledge and we use science as a tool that is directed by our inner knowledge, our heart sight, you could say, you know, that doesn't happen by accident. Just like scientific knowledge doesn't happen by accident, but there's very well worked out methods and tools and approaches. There's teaching and there is learning. The inner knowledge also doesn't happen by accident. And it's something, you know, we've used words like intentionality, gratitude, different words to describe different aspects of it. But I think, you know, that has to be the foundation, and that has to be the basis. And we can't just treat it as an afterthought. Oh, some people are grateful and some people aren't. Some people lead with intention, some people don't. It can't be an afterthought. You know, that has to be something that really has to be emphasized and has to be taken seriously. And as much as we develop our outer knowledge, we need to learn how to cultivate those inner qualities so that we can bring that to science, and science can then serve these bigger purposes. Science and service to society. So that's the kind of takeaway feeling that I have from listening to all of your experiences.
Thank you, Bradley. Elizabeth?
Well, kind of echoing what Anna said about things being fun, I think that's really key. I know that's a really basic thing, but making things exciting and cool is a huge way to shift. You know, I think somebody was mentioning paradigm shifts. And also, Danielle was talking about wonder. And I feel like as a non-scientist, that's what brings me to science, is like when it just the sense of wonder that it gives. And I guess the question I would leave with is something I found fascinating in religious studies, is that a lot of, when you go back really, really in the ancient linguistics, the terms for God and goddesses, and I'm not going to go into all the different places, but a lot have to do with what you libate, what you pour things onto, and that's, you know, it obviously changed over the years. But I kind of think like all the things we're talking about is like everybody has a life world that they're libating. And what are you libating? What are you making sacred?
Well, thank you for that, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for those comments. This has been a really, really interesting conversation, and I think there's so many things to bring this to a close that we've heard today. And I really want to thank everyone in the chat for engaging in the conversation as we've gone along. And I think that what I'd like to leave us with is this thought that as we're all looking here, that thinking together and feeling together the way forward with heart forward science, how do we do that? How do we bring the best of all that we are to all that we do as scientists and scholars, as human beings on this planet? And so thank you, Jim, for this opportunity for us to have joined you here today. Really appreciate that and look forward to the rest of Humanity Rising Summit. So thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you all. This has been a inspiring and fitting, I would say almost conclusion to our contemplation of the 75th anniversaries of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to have a group as humble and as collaborative and as committed to truth pursued rather than truth possessed to join us. And I was thinking while you were talking, you know, it is said of Einstein that he used to get up very early and walk right at dawn on the grass in bare feet, because there was something about the dew on the grass coming up through the soles of his feet, he said, that gave him his best ideas. And that was the great Einstein. And, you know, when you think of all the dreams and intuitions that have shaped the great scientists over the ages, you know, what you folks have been saying is just so profoundly true. And I think, Elizabeth, what you said right at the end is worth underscoring, is what you libate, what you pour the sacred waters upon, shapes your notion of the sacred. And maybe the Copernican revolution of our day in science is to move from the notion that matter is inert, we live in a ultimately meaningless world, and everything is a secular pursuit. Just think of what science would become if it was around the pursuit of the sacred. It would shift everything. And you have embodied that deep impulse. So I just want to thank you. Thank you very, very much. It's been heartwarming, particularly after the visuals and the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You folks have pointed the way. So I just want to thank you. And tomorrow we'll deepen the dialogue. We're going to go into a discourse by Anne Baring, who's one of the great authors of our time. She wrote the great masterwork, The Myth of the Goddess, which may be the greatest work ever written on the goddess and the deep feminine through history. And then her other masterwork is called The Dream of the Cosmos. So she'll be speaking to us tomorrow, along with Sailesh Rao, who is the founder of Climate Healers, about the nature of spirituality as it's being shaped by our climate crisis. Then the day after tomorrow, we're going to be concluding our first phase at day 83. It's the International Day of Youth, by having young people from around the world speak to us about their experiences of the pandemic and their vision of the world beyond. So thank you, everyone. We will see you same time, same station, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. Central European time tomorrow for the continuation, day 82 of Humanity Rising. Thank you, Valerie. Very courageous what you did today. Thank you.